Written by Erutious. Court is now in session. All rise for the Honorable George Kane. My lawyer and I stood as the judge walked in. He glanced out at the assembly, his eyes falling to me before he took his seat and set a pair of little half spectacles and read over the court docket. I watched him as he looked over the case information and couldn't help but catch the glances he shot at me. He knew who I was. They all did. But they didn't realize that they were about to see the last thing any of them expected today. They were about to see me walk away scot-free. Court is now in session. Case 2274, State v. Murphy. The bailiff read, stepping back and looking to the judge. Prosecutor, you may make your opening statement. The prosecutor for the state was tall, his suit looking like it must have cost a fortune if they charged by the foot, and when he rose you would swear he topped out at 7 feet. I'd been expecting that they would send an older man, a more seasoned prosecutor, but this guy looked to be barely 25. He turned his back on my lawyer and I, addressing the jury in a soft, cultured voice that seemed at odds with his size. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is well known that on August 4th, 2018, Emma Parker was hiking up Route 12 after having exited her boyfriend's car after the two had a nasty fight. She was then picked up by Mr. Alex Murphy as she neared the number 24 off-ramp. Her body was discovered at the rest stop bathroom near Decatur 2 days later, at a rest stop that Mr. Murphy had been seen dropping her off at. Mr. Murphy's vehicle also contained hair follicles and traces of blood from the victim. Given the proximity of Mr. Murphy to the crime scene and the evidence present in his van, we will prove that he is the murderer beyond a shadow of a doubt. I scoffed quietly as the man sat back down. Beyond a shadow of a doubt might be a little challenging. All the evidence they had was circumstantial at best, and I knew it. They would have an easier time proving I hadn't killed her. His lawyer would have little trouble getting him out of this, so he could get back to it. Back to the business of hunting. Defense, you may make your opening statement. My lawyer approached the jury and I found myself glaring at him as he left. This Weasley little fuck had cost me way more than I felt comfortable with. But if he got me off, then it would be money well spent. He had talked a big game in his office, telling me about the clients he'd gotten out of jail and the cases he'd won. But I had a feeling that most of that was puff and blow. He did not convey the same level of confidence that the prosecutor had, but I barely needed him to. This case was open and shut. They had nothing on me, would have nothing on me, and we all knew it. Now he just had to convince the jury.
Men and women of the jury, the accusations leveled at my client are egregious. The victim's blood and hair found in my client's vehicle were there not because of his action, but the actions of Mr. Chadwick Rolls, who I noticed is neither present nor in police custody. Furthermore, there is evidence in my possession that will clear my client without a shadow of a doubt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I intend to strip the artifice of this case away and reveal what it really is. Incompetence. Incompetence of the part of the Georgia Highway Patrol and the active witch hunt on my client. Make no mistake, his innocence will be proven by the end of these proceedings.
The little insect sauntered back like he was the biggest rooster on the yard, and I couldn't say he hasn't earned it. The retainer I'd been forced to pay him was well worth the speech I had just heard. His eloquent words and well-presented facts had almost led me to believe I might be innocent. If I hadn't have been the one who choked that girl to death as she came out of the stall, I might have believed it myself. The trial proceeded slowly. The prosecution called Officer McGinnis to the stand, that big bulldog that worked for the highway patrol, who painted me as a thug and a drug mule. He told a tale of 7 other girls they had found dead along Route 12 and 14. They'd all died along my route, a route that was taken by many different people, but specifically me when I make my deliveries. Eyewitnesses said that I had interacted with several of these women, had been seen offering rides to 2 of them, in fact. They had all been dumped along the side of the road or near the truck stop where Emma Parker had been found strangled to death. My lawyer objected to this, claiming I had never been formally accused of these crimes, only a suspect before being released due to lack of evidence. Evidence? As if they'd ever caught me with evidence. I wasn't an idiot. I burned their clothes, I cleaned my truck after every kill, and I never let anyone see me dumping the bodies. As a delivery driver, I keep weird hours. These hours are conductive to my work. Need to dump a body? 3 a.m. is an excellent time for it. Need to clean your truck out? Car washes with self-service areas are extremely empty before daylight. Need to burn something? A fire in the woods doesn't draw a great deal of attention in the early afternoon. I knew when the best times to dispose of evidence were and the best ways to do it. I'd had lots of practice. The judge let my lawyer's objection pass, wanting to know what this had to do with the case. The state's lawyer claimed motive and my alleged ties to the other murders. All the girls were young, 18 to 22, brunette and slim. This, he claimed, would prove that I had a type. Again, my lawyer claimed this was circumstantial, and the judge agreed. The officer exited the stand, and the lawyer began his next gambit. I sat back comfortably, seeing this for the fishing expedition that it was. I snapped back to attention when I heard someone behind me laugh. I turned my head, seeing a pair of girls whispering to each other not far off. Were they laughing at me? No one laughed at me. I had killed people for laughing at me. Emma Parker could have testified to that. She, as well as a few of the other deceased, knew that it was a bad idea to laugh at me. My first victim, a girl in my 4th grade class, had made that mistake and paid for it. One of the boys in my class had decided to pull my pants down at gym, displaying my tighty whities for everyone to see. The whole class had laughed, but she had laughed the loudest. Helen Darren, a brunette with pigtails that nearly touched her shoulders, had been red-faced and guffawing as I tried to pull my pants up, tears spilling down my face. Oh, but I had had the last laugh, hadn't I? We took the same route home every day, and when I wrapped my hands around her throat and pulled her into the woods, her face turned red again. She fought some, but I had surprised her, and she wasn't as strong as I was. When she stopped moving, I hadn't known what to do initially, but I had figured it out pretty quickly. I'd gotten lucky that time. A freak blizzard had befallen my county the next night, a blizzard in October of all things, and the winter that year was brutal. They hadn't found her until the snows thawed in May, and by then any evidence I might have left was gone. My lawyer's objection brought me out of my revelry.
Objection, Your Honor. The evidence presented is counter to the accounts given by my client and the coroner. The coroner report states that the head wound was old. She had received it before being picked up by the defendant. As such, the presence of blood and hair in the car is circumstantial.
The judge allowed it this time. Swarmy prick. But I had to say I was pretty impressed with this dweeb. He may look like a Simpsons character, but he had the heart of a lion somewhere under it all. Who knows, maybe I'd even buy him a beer once all this was over. Maybe I'd even make him my next victim if he wasn't a black-haired dweeb. They had trotted out some old lady who had seen Emma getting into the back of my truck then. The bitch actually said when my lawyer asked that the head wound was there when she saw her. So there went that. I was just a good Samaritan, someone who helps people. Then they found some attendant at the truck stop who saw me put her out, but also thought that he saw my truck there too a few minutes later. I tried to play it cool, but that was news to me. I didn't think anyone had seen me double back, but if he had, he could screw up my whole trial. The laughter dragged its spider legs over the back of my neck, and I jerked around to see who it was. The girls were looking forward, listening to the witness, and I couldn't see anyone else mugging back there. Who the hell was laughing? My life could be on the line, and someone was freaking laughing. I'd kill them. I'd choke the life out of them. No one laughed at.
Mr. Miles, can you tell me the license plate on my client's vehicle?
I turned around again. I hadn't even heard the dweeb move. The hick on the stand scratched his head, but finally shook it.
No, sir, I don't suppose I can.
What does the defendant's truck look like?
Well, it's a deep blue cab with a silver trailer.
Thank you, Mr. Miles, for describing every truck in the Laramie fleet. Thank you for describing thousands of trucks on the road today. Did you see my client climb out of the truck?
Well, no,
Did you see him strangle Miss Parker?
The man seemed flustered.
Jesus Christ, no, of course not.
Then I move this man's statement be expunged. He cannot properly identify my client's vehicle and did not witness the murder of Miss Parker.
The witness identified Mr. Murphy's truck from a lineup successfully. The prosecutor snapped back. The judge banged his gavel and told both of them to be quiet. I just smirked. This was not going well for them. So far, the prosecution was looking pretty incompetent, but that was to be expected. The whole operation had been pretty incompetent from the get-go. Through some eyewitness testimony, they had decided that I was a person of interest and brought me in for questioning. I told them about my job, the amount of travel between my facility in Decatur and the surrounding areas, and the hours that I often worked. As I sat there, telling them little tidbits, they had no idea that they had caught their killer and were getting ready to let me go. Was a lot of traffic up that route. A lot more trucks than just mine on the road. And after some probing questions and an inspection of my cab, they had no choice but to turn me loose. I had thought that would be the end of it. The prosecutor trotted in a forensics expert, citing the blood and hair found in the back of my cab as proof that I had been in possession of the body. I was trying to listen, but that skeletal snickering was rankling me. I suddenly turned my head, scaring some old blue hair behind me who was listening, and scanned the crowd for the source of the laughing. Nobody fucking laughed at me. Emma had learned that. For the briefest of seconds, I thought I saw Emma, her brunette hair hanging limply and her face still purple and lifeless. But the person was gone a moment later. I jumped when my lawyer touched my arm.
Hey, be cool. The judge is looking at you. What the hell are you doing?
I looked, and sure enough, the judge was looking directly at me as the forensic guy made his case. I straightened myself as my lawyer rose to cross-examine, trying not to look as angry as I felt. After I killed Amber Hodges, I began to notice some extra scrutiny. Highway patrolmen followed me a little longer and seemed to show up when I was making deliveries. I lost several prospective victims because they were always sniffing about. You see, I never killed more than I strictly had to. Killers who go for body count always get sloppy in the end and make a mistake. I had killed maybe 1 in 10 girls that I picked up along that route. Some of them were hitchhikers, some of them had car trouble, but all of them were stranded and needed the help of a good Samaritan. I took them to gas stations, rest stops, wherever along my route they needed to go, or as close to where they needed to go as I could. I killed some of them, but most of them got out and led normal enough lives. This was also to throw off the police, but it worked against me too. One of them had seen me pick up Amber Hodges, but they hadn't seen me put her back out again. Before I knew it, I was at the police station again. They had tied me somehow to several of the other girls. I had picked them up, but no one could confirm that I had dropped them off. They had found many of the dump sites near my route, but had found no evidence tying me to the sites. At that point, all they had to go by was the fact that I had picked her up, though, and since the officer hadn't bothered to follow me all day, they were forced to cut me loose. They made it very clear, though, that I was a person of interest in this case, and that made me cautious. I had gone 2 months before killing again, and Emma wasn't even intended to be my next victim. But she laughed at me, and then had forced my hand. My lawyer asked the forensics guy if he had seen the body of Emma Parker. He said he had, and that it had been strangled to death with a belt left at the scene. My lawyer nodded and asked if he had seen the head wound she had received earlier that day, a head wound that had not killed her. The forensics guy seemed a little taken aback by this, but said that he was aware of the head wound. It was well documented, that head wound, so I figured he had been instructed not to bring it up unless he really had to.
And are you also aware that this head wound was not, in fact, the result of my client's actions, but the actions of her boyfriend, Chadwick Rolls?
The forensics guy nodded, looking defeated.
My client also allowed her to sleep in the back of his truck, which is why there was blood on the sleeper bed in the back. Miss Parker laid her head down, getting the blood on it, and providing you with a reason to hassle my client.
The prosecutor objected, but my lawyer abated and came to sit down. The prosecution rested then, and my lawyer rose to begin his own list of witnesses. His list was short, 2 people, and he was clearly looking for an easy win and an early day. I wanted to be mad about this, but honestly, I couldn't fault the guy. If you can get an easy win, you take it. The courthouse was quiet as he called his first witness, and that was the only reason I heard a cluster of chuckles that erupted from the assembled observers. I tried to ignore it, hearing them chatter and squawk, but it really galled me. How dare they fucking laugh at me? I wanted to hurt them. I wanted to see their faces and make them regret ever having thought they could get away with laughing at me. I composed my face, seeing the judge was watching me, but I felt an entirely irrational rage building in me. In a move that seemed to stun the crowd, my lawyer called Chadwick Rolls to the stand. Chadwick swaggered up to the stand, his polo shirt already stained as it strained against his sculpted chest. He had taken my lawyer's advice and not worn his cap, but he still had a pair of expensive sunglasses nestled amongst his short brown hair. His khaki pants had been ironed, and his shoes had been shined. He could almost pass for a respectable person. He looked miserable. My lawyer asked him to state his name, and the frat boy gave it as evenly as he could. I suspected he might be hungover, maybe even still drunk and found my anger bubbling again. This stupid punk couldn't have stayed out of a bottle long enough to clear my name. My lawyer asked him about the events of the day in question. Chad told the jury how he and Emma had been arguing. He may have pushed her a little against the window, and when she saw that she was bleeding, she had gotten out and refused to get back in. Chad had followed her for a little while, telling her he was sorry and to get back in, but she refused and just kept walking up the side of the road. Chad had left then, not having time for her crap, and driven back to campus. He had heard the next day that she was missing. He had not seen her get into my truck. The prosecutor got up to cross-examine him, but there wasn't much to act on. Chad's whole reason for being here was to corroborate that he had been the one to hit her, not me. If he could prove that she had been wounded before she got in my truck, then it might help cast doubt on my ability to have murdered anyone. My lawyer had promised amnesty for Chad if he helped us. The two had been fighting, and it wasn't as if Emma had filed a report or anything. He climbed off the stand and slouched away, shooting me a dark look as he passed. I guess he was mad that I had axed his ex. Then it was my turn to take the stand. The crowd murmured when I was called, but I climbed up to the box as though I hadn't a care in the world. I smiled out at them as I sat there, already confident that I would be home by tonight and on the hunt again by tomorrow. This would be like a roller coaster. Hours of wasted time for a 5-minute ride, followed by the exhilaration of escape. I could already taste the freedom.
Mr. Murphy, in your own words, could you tell us what happened on the day in question?
I had found her walking along the side of the road. She looked drugged out and kept sliding her hand up to hold her head. She fit my profile, pretty, brunette, and young, but I had already decided not to kill her. I pulled up next to her and offered her a ride. She had hesitated, and I thought for a second she would refuse me. But she nodded and climbed in as we rumbled on. We rode together for a little while, her joking and smiling despite her wound, and me teasing and flirting good-naturedly. I felt her looking at me sometime, not uncommon for a woman to do so, and we'd been driving for about half an hour when she asked if she could lie down in the back. Her head was a tacky mess, and I gave her a bottle of water to clean the wound in the little washroom off the sleeper cab. She came out a little wet, but her hair was free of the blood. She smiled, swishing her hips a little for me to see, and I climbed into the sleeper cab. When I pulled over a few moments later, I figured I could surprise her with a little more than flirting. I saw Miss Parker walking up the side of the road and offered her a ride. She agreed, and after riding for a while, she asked to use the sleeper so she could rest. After a half hour, she came back out and asked to be dropped off at the Decatur rest stop. I parked and let her out. She thanked me and walked toward the visitor center. I pulled out of the parking lot and left the rest stop. That was the last I saw of her. She had come awake when I straddled her eyes suddenly opening. I ran a hand against her, my jeans already left outside the sleeper, but I didn't receive the fear I was hoping for. She looked worried for half a heartbeat, but then smirked and lifted a hand to her mouth. That was when I realized that I hadn't stiffened. It happened from time to time. My little problem would flare up, and I stumbled off her as she sat up a bit. "I would have let you have a go if you'd asked, handsome," she had said, teasing. "But it looks like you're not ready for action." Then she laughed, and it took everything I had not to kill her right there.
"And at you at any time enter the rest stop?"
"No," I answered. She had still been smiling when we pulled into the rest stop parking lot. "Thanks for the lift, handsome. And don't worry, I won't tell anyone about your performance issues." As I watched her walking towards the welcome center, I knew it would be the last laughing she ever did. I parked the truck by the road about half a mile up and turned on the hazard lights. I was back at the rest stop in no time. I snuck up, not wanting to be seen, and watched her step into the bathroom through the glass windows of the welcome center. The woman behind the counter was missing, and I took advantage of her absence to slip into the bathroom unseen. She was in a stall by the door, pants around her ankles, and humming to herself. I noticed a sign on the wall, closed for cleaning, and slipped it onto the door. I wanted to kick the door open and throttle her, but instead I stepped into the adjoining stall and pulled my pants down waiting. She was out again in a few minutes, but the wait seemed to stretch forever. I pulled my pants up as the water ran, and when I stepped up, she looked and saw me. She smiled and turned to ask what I was doing here. Her smile died about a minute before she did. She tried to break my hold, but when I bowed her over the sink, she knew she couldn't stop me. Her gasping sounded a little like laughing. Her mouth laughing her life away as I choked her. That made me madder. My fingers gripping her throat and leaving deep bruises. The capillaries in her eyes burst as she tried to fight me off. And when she finally went limp, I kept squeezing for another minute or so. I left her on the bathroom floor like a discarded condom, shimmying out the window near the back. I was in my truck and driving before an hour had passed. The judge looked at the prosecutor, but he shook his head, knowing he had nothing to add.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. You may step down.
I stood to leave and felt my legs turn to water beneath me. She was there. She was sitting on the front row staring at me, grinning a too-wide smile as her bloody eyes looked right through me. The judge was saying something, telling me to get off the stand, but I couldn't. I was mouthing wordlessly, my lawyer giving me a filthy look that said plainly that he wanted me to get off the stand. I couldn't. I could see the purple marks pulsing around her neck as her skin became molted and bruised. "You," I whispered, the bailiff approaching as I continued to waffle up there. "Come on, handsome. Come get what you wanted in the back of that truck," she hissed, wiggling her chest as her skin turned from pale flower to something like a bruised peach. "No one will make fun of your little problem where you're going," she purred, chuckling in that mechanical way that she had chuckled all day. That laughter rankled me, lying on my skin like a dead fish, and I realized that it had been her all day. She had been sitting behind me, laughing at me, knowing that I would lose even before I began. "You bitch," I yelled, fighting against the bailiff as he tried to drag me out of the box. "Don't you laugh at me. Don't you laugh at me. I killed you. I watched you die. You'll never laugh at anyone again. I fucking won. I killed you." The bailiff finally succeeded in dragging me away, my ranting still spewing like sludge from a pipe. The laughter began to echo around me as I was dragged away, the courtroom erupting as the judge banged his gavel for silence. I could see them changing as they dragged me away, the courtroom beginning to fill with the creatures before the door to the court banged shut and cut them off from view. That was 6 months ago. I had to record this today, just to be sure I wouldn't forget. When someone came to get me after the trial, it was to take me to a place even worse than prison, even worse than death row. They took me to a man in a nice suit who asked me about the courtroom. I told the truth. I told about the creatures. I told him about Emma, and as she sat on the front row and turned into one of them, I told him about the laughter I could still hear vibrating in the back of my skull. He wrote it all down, smiling placidly before looking up and nodding slowly. "Well, sounds like you may not be going to prison after all, Mr. Murphy." "I won't?" I asked, almost sheepishly. Oh no, sounds as though you've had a nervous breakdown. We can't let you go to prison in your current mental state." That's how I came to be here. Sitting in the day room wearing a gown instead of a jumpsuit and watching Sesame Street with these drooling morons instead of waiting for the needle to make the laughing go away. The monsters are here too. They move amongst them and make their laughter sound like screams. They walk the halls, and none of the orderlies or doctors see them. They live amongst us, and I'm beginning to think that we might be their food. But they won't touch me. Why won't they touch me? They just look at me with their sightless eyes and move on to the next one. They leave me to dwell within this pit as I listen to the laughter that only exists in an insane asylum. They leave me to go mad amongst the laughter of hell. Thank you for listening. You can probably handle another horror story, right?